Hello, this is the luckiest maths teacher in the world. Thank you so much for tuning in to this video in which we'll go through solving quadratic equations. So in this video, we're going to solve by factorizing and using the null factor law. So the null factor law basically says if two things multiply to give 0, either the first thing equals 0 or the second thing you multiplied equals 0. So let's see how that applies for quadratic equations. So what we're aiming to do, we'll start with a quadratic expression. Remember, that means it has an x squared term. We will factorize to get something like this. So what we have is something times something equals 0. So the null factor law says either the first something is equal to 0, which would mean x equals 3, or the second something is equal to 0, in which case x would be minus 4. So this highlights something special. For quadratic equations, there are sometimes two solutions. There's sometimes one, there are sometimes no solutions. All the previous equations we've done, the linear equations, they always had one and only one solution, but not the same for quadratic equations. So another type of quadratic equation is x times x plus 5 is equal to 0. So once again, we have something times something is equal to 0. The null factor law tells us either the first something equals 0 or the second something is equal to 0. And if x plus 5 equals 0, x equals minus 5. How easy is that? So if we have something like 2x plus 3 times 5x minus 8 equals 0, using the null factor law, either the first something is equal to 0, so that would mean 2x plus 3 is equal to 0. This is just a linear equation, you solve it like normal. Subtract 3 from both sides, and then divide each side by 2. So that's one solution. So the other solution is 5x minus 8 equals 0. Add 8 to both sides, and then divide each side by 5. So the two solutions are minus 3 over 2 and 8 over 5. Now these were very easy quadratic equations to solve because the factorization was already done for you. Now we're going to look at examples where it's not done for you and you need to factorize. So let's look at this equation here, x squared plus 6x equals 0. So it's a quadratic equation because of this x squared term. Now this is a quadratic binomial because there are two terms. So what we don't want to do, we don't want to, subtract 6x from both sides. We don't want to handle this originally like a linear equation, where we try to balance each side. If you do that, you'll be there all day and you won't get anywhere. What we want to do is factorize and then use the null factor law. So we know how to factorize the binomial. It's using highest common factor. Highest common factor is x. So we have x times x plus 6 is equal to 0. Now it's like all the other ones I did on the previous slide. We can use the null factor law. Either the first thing equals 0, or the second thing equals 0, which would mean x is minus 6. So let's say we had an equation like this. So highest common factor is now 2x. So 2x times x gives 2x squared. 2x times negative 6 gives you negative 12x. So either the first thing is equal to 0, that would mean x is equal to 0, or the second thing is equal to 0, in which case x equals 6. So once again, we've seen a quadratic equation, and we have two solutions. So x squared minus 81 equals 0. This is a quadratic equation because of the x squared term. It's still a binomial, but we can't use highest common factor. This is a perfect square minus perfect square. We use difference of two squares. So remember what we do is we square root the first, we square root the second, one gets a plus, one gets a minus. So I don't want you to treat this like a linear equation and add 81 to both sides. People always get mixed up when they do that. They only get one solution. What I want you to do is factorize and then use the null factor law. So we've got something times something equals 0. So either the first something equals 0. So if the first bracket equals 0, we get x is minus 9. If this bracket equals 0, we get x is positive 9. They are the two solutions, and we're done. So quadratic equations never have more than 2 solutions. They always have 0, 1, or 2. So 4x squared minus 9 equals 0. This is again difference of 2 squares. So we're going to factorize it. Square root the first, square root the second. 1 gets a plus, 1 gets a minus. After you've factorized, you use the null factor law. So either the first bracket is equal to 0, so subtract 3 and divide each side by 2, or the second bracket equals 0. This time we would add 3 and divide by 2. So when you're using the null factor law, now we've treated these like linear equations, but I don't want you to do that originally. I don't want you to add 9 to both sides and solve like a linear equation. You only use the process of linear equations after you factorized. So 3x squared minus 27 equals 0. This is one of those binomials for which you need to use both highest common factor and difference of 2 squares. So taking out the highest common factor leaves us this. Note x squared minus 9 is the difference of 2 squares. So we have 3, so we set up our brackets, square root the first, square root the second, 1 gets a plus, 1 gets a minus. So when you have the 3 out the front like you do here, it doesn't affect the solution. It's clearly not 0. So we have x plus 3 is equal to 0, which would mean x is minus 3, or x minus 3 is equal to 0, and that would mean x is positive 3, because 3 minus 3 equals 0. So they are our 2 solutions, and we're done. We're now going to look at solving some quadratic trinomial equations. So let's say we have x squared plus 6x plus 8 equals 0. So the only thing that differs here is how we factorize. Remember, we factorize quadratic trinomials. We set up our brackets, and the 2 numbers that go in the brackets are 2 numbers that multiply to 8 and add to 6. So that'll be 4 and 2. So now that we factorize, we use the null factor law. If the first bracket equals 0, if x plus 4 equals 0, x is minus 4. If the second bracket equals 0, x is minus 2. They are our 2 solutions, and we're done. So x squared minus 7x plus 12 equals 0. So 2 numbers that multiply to positive 12 and add to negative 7, minus 4 and minus 3. So either the first bracket equals 0 or the second bracket equals 0, and we're done. So x squared minus x minus 6 equals 0. So you guessed it, set up our 2 brackets. 2 numbers that multiply to negative 6 and add to negative 1 are minus 3 and positive 2. Now that it's factorized, we use the null factor law. If the first bracket equals 0, we have x equals 3. If the second bracket equals 0, we have x equals minus 2. So let's look at the equation x squared plus 8x plus 16 equals 0. So we're going to do that the same way. We're going to factorize it first. But the thing here is the 2 numbers that add to 8 and multiply to 16 are the same. They're both 4. So this is an example of a quadratic that has only one solution. Its only solution is x equals minus 4. And similarly here, the 2 numbers that multiply to positive 25 and add to negative 10 are both negative 5. So this is x minus 5 squared is equal to 0. It has only one solution. If the bracket is equal to 0, x equals positive 5. That is the only solution. So let's look at this quadratic equation. 2x squared equals 20x minus 42. So this one looks a bit different. It's the first one we've done that wasn't equal to 0. Now, what happens with quadratic equations is we need one side to equal 0 so we can use the null factor law. The null factor law only works for 0. If I have 2 things that multiply to, say, 4, you can't tell me anything about those numbers. They could be 2 and 2, 4 and 1. It could be 8 and a half. But if two numbers multiply to 0, that's a special case. We can say one or both of those numbers must be 0. So that's why you always need one side of the quadratic equation to equal 0. If one side doesn't equal 0, you must first make it equal 0. So what we're going to do is get everything to one side. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to subtract 20x from both sides. So then I'm left with this. Now I still don't have one side equal to 0, and I can't use the null factor law. So what I need to do now is add 42 to both sides. And if I do that, I get 2x squared minus 20x plus 42 is equal to 0. So this is an equivalent equation to this, and I'm going to use this one to solve so I can use the null factor law. You must have one side equal to 0 to use the null factor law. So no different now. I'm just going to factorize the quadratic expression here. So there's a common factor of 2, so I'll take that out, and I'm left with x squared minus 10x plus 21 is equal to 0. So as I mentioned in a previous example, if you have a number at the front, it doesn't affect the solution. So I can just solve for this equaling 0. So I'm just going to factorize this trinomial. Two numbers that multiply to 21 and add to negative 10 will be negative 7 and negative 3. So once again, the 2 will not affect the solution. Either this will equal 0, x minus 7 equals 0, which means x equals 7, or this will equal 0. If x minus 3 equals 0, then we get x equals 3, and we are done. All right, so remember the process is make sure one side equals 0, which it almost always does. If not, make one side equal 0. Then you factorize using the process that we learned in previous lessons, and then you use the null factor law. The null factor law says if two things multiply to 0, either the first thing is equal to 0 or the second thing is equal to 0. All right, thank you so much for tuning into this video. This has been the luckiest maths teacher in the world. Have a great day.